thank you so much for coming today. I have been quite excited to be here today to talk about the mix of some of my two favorite tools, Power BI and ADF or Synapse. So I hope that you are equally excited, and in today's special themed event, we are going to do epic refresh in Power BI with ADF and Synapse. Yeah. So I don't know if I see some people in the audience maybe also a bit tired. There was a big party today. You can tell maybe a bit from the voice, but it should be fine. So my name is Mathias Halkjær Petersen. I'm a principal architect in data analytics in a company, pan-European company called Fellowmine. I'm a Microsoft MVP, bunch of other stuff. Also a parent to a child, 6 years old. But most important of all, I have here my favorite tools, Power BI, Synapse, and of course SQL. We will never not have to work with SQL in some way. Besides that, I'm also very active on LinkedIn, so if anyone here in the audience is too, or want to be, just you can use this QR code to connect with me. I'll make sure to accept, and if you have any questions or, well, just discussions you want to have, I'm always up for a good dialogue. And I mean, if the QR code is trouble, you can always just search my name. It's not that hard. I also have my personal blog, fluxbi.com, and as well as hosting the Power BI quiz and the data platform quiz, which will be next time, actually next week. So a little bit of a fun, informal get-together among other data geeks. I can definitely recommend that. But let's move on to the actual topic that we're here for. So I have here an agenda of what we're going through. So first of all, we are going to talk about why we even would consider going beyond Power BI. We'll explore some of the toolbox that of the options that were available in also this case I have here today. Then look at an example implementation. And actually before that, look at the basics. How do we actually refresh Power BI outside of just the UI? Finally, demonstration, look at how it could be done. So I brought here today an actual real-life implementation, but it's also, how would you say it? Warts and all. It's also as is. I mean, so you may not want to copy my code, or you may not want to do it exactly as is, but it should hopefully inspire you that you could do something similar in your own organization. And finally, of course, we can have a bit of discussion. So for the first question, why would we even want to go beyond what we can do in Power BI? Because we can do most of the things in Power BI. Well, there are some limitations. The first limitation is, of course, the UI only lets us choose refreshes for half-hour intervals. We can refresh at 9 in the morning. We can refresh in 9:30. But if I wanted to do it at 9:05 or 9:10, it's just not possible. Then we also have the limit on the amount of refreshes. We have 8 for Pro, and we have 48 for Premium, which is the documented limit, because the reality is that in Premium we can actually update it unlimited time as is. It's not something Microsoft will guarantee, but if you try and go and not use the UI, you can actually go beyond this limit for Premium, but you cannot for the Pro. Yeah. Besides that, no, never mind. So, some of the challenges. That's the first one, probably the biggest one. When we refresh in Power BI, we just do it at a certain chosen time. And we don't have the control of making sure that whatever we're loading is done doing their own processing. So if we have a data warehouse, it may be an awkward time, and if we're very unlucky, we may actually start pulling in this data at the same time as the data warehouse is doing all its processing, and suddenly we can have a truncated data set, or a limited data set, or a messy data set. And this is not what we want. So definitely, syncing up with whatever other backend sources we're using is a very good, is a challenge. The schedule time is imprecise. I don't know if you guys have noticed that. You say you want to update at 8, but suddenly it starts at 8, well, I think 820 I've seen in some cases. And at some point, I really would have loved to find the documentation, so don't take my word for this. I think I found somewhere on Microsoft that they promise only to make sure they have executed the refresh within 2 hours. And that is not even an SLA guarantee. That's just we will try to. But I mean, in reality, it does happen much faster, but it doesn't happen on schedule. It is imprecise. It can take 5 minutes longer. It can take 10 minutes longer, and that's before it even starts. And then we have a third problem, and that is, if it does 4 consecutive attempts of loading data and fails, it will actually disable the whole automated refresh. And that is, in my experience, a big problem, especially if working with Premium, because if you set it to refresh every half hour, you only need a downtime of the source system for 2 hours, and then everything stops refreshing, and you need to go in and do that again manually. And that can, of course, be a problem. And there's actually one more I didn't. So under for the imprecise schedule time. So if we look at the 2 first points, it's not just about syncing with the data lake and making it more precise. It's also about the fact that for every of these time wasters, we delay the time from when the data is actually fresh in our data warehouse or in our system until it arrives at Power BI. So let's say our data warehouse starts doing its thing at 8. And then around 20 minutes past 8, it's done. But Power BI, well, we need some buffer time, and we can only say, let's say it's done 35 minutes after 8. And we need our buffer time, so we of course set it to 9. And already there, 25 minutes wasted. Then at 9, it may take 20 minutes before it even starts, so then again, 20 more minutes wasted. And very quickly, we have some data that is supposed to be just refreshed or new and fresh, but it's already up to almost an hour old before we even start using it Power BI. So all these little things actually can cause quite a bit of delay when you add them up. So I brought here a case from a real-life client. They had the classic problem that the data sources were getting overloaded from all the data sets that created in Power BI. So we needed to fix that. And that's a different topic for a different talk, but we fixed it, of course, by implementing some sort of data warehouse for handling the loads in a structured manner and only having to pull data from the source once, and then we could process it in data warehouse. Once every time it needs to be processed, of course. Then this client had a bit of a special use case because they actually wanted the same data loaded into 2 different data sets, but one in Power BI Pro and one in Power BI Premium. We don't need to go into details of why they wanted to do that, but it was something about the cost of Premium, and they could have a bunch of users only use Pro licenses if it did it like this. And then they had other users that needed the data faster, could only use the Premium per user license. So, this client had all these problems I mentioned before. They had the problem that they actually wanted the Premium users to have the data new and fresh because they needed it. They needed to see fresh data, but it was already hours old when it was updated, or half an hour to an hour old when it was updated, and that was of course problematic. But even worse, they had the problem that whenever this was scheduled, because they wanted such a high frequency, there's just so high chance of that interfering with the whole truncated tables and the processing and all that. So we of course took the first simple step, as you will see here in the next slides. So we explored the toolbox. We looked at what are the options, and the first step is pretty clear. And I think also most in the audience here, you figured this step out. But we are going to go through it in case anyone happens. So the first step, of course, is we can do the data refresh in the Power BI service. There's also the option we considered, could do it with some Power Automate. Of course, the REST API, very good candidate. And then we considered integration pipelines in ADF. They can also be used to start this refresh. And we also had the options of using something in Azure SQL and or in a data lake. So that was what we considered. And we started solving the quickest and the easiest and the biggest problem. And that was the how to get the dataset to refresh right after the data warehouse is done. And I want to put emphasis on this because I think in maybe 80–90% of all cases, this is more than enough, and this is a way to keep it simple. So no reason to make it even more complex if we can avoid that. But before we move on, let's start checking and seeing how we actually can refresh the Power BI dataset outside of the service. So this is what we're going to go through for refreshing the dataset, in this case in Azure Data Factory. There are some steps that needs to be done before we can use the REST API to do something like dataset refresh. We need to have an AD security group in our Azure tenant. We need to get the identity object from our Azure Data Factory or Synapse. Then we need to add this managed identity to that security group. And finally, add that security group to an option in our Power BI Admin Center. So this means if you ever want to set this up, you do need to involve people in your organization who has access to your Azure Active Directory, as well as people who has access to your Power BI admin settings. So anyone who's a Power BI administrator. And then you need to enable it, set it up, make sure it works, and as a step more, add this ADF managed identity to the workspace so it actually has access to the dataset. And finally, we can go create a pipeline with all what is described here to make the refresh. So that was the steps, and I added these because then I will put the slides up after, and if you ever want to work this out, you can go back and check the slides and follow it if you want to try it out. But let's see it in action. So, let's first look at our, Let's first check here in our Power BI. So I just have a bunch of different data sets so we can play around with them now and later. But I'll just for now pick the daily data set here. First of all, I need some info about the data set to actually refresh it. And the easiest way that I've learned to get this info is just go into the dataset information here. It's actually not written anywhere, but if you go to the URL at the top of your browser, you will have all the information you need. So this will be your ID for the workspace it's in. This one. Can you see it? Yeah. And this one is the information for your dataset ID. I know it's a bit compressed and blurry, but the numbers doesn't really matter. Just know that they are up there and it's clearly defined. Then we can go and do all the steps. We go to our Azure portal, Active Directory, here under groups, we can add a new group, and we could call it something SQL bits. Great, and now we needed to add the data factory to this group. So there's two ways that I usually get this ID. Sometimes it's usually here. I'm actually not sure why it's not. It would be if it was a Synapse instance, but otherwise the other trick I sometimes do, because you forget where you're supposed to find it, is in ADF, create a link service, and if you pick SQL, and on the authentication system assigned managed identity, you will get the information from here, and you can just copy that. Yeah, I was about to say the next step is you could also, if you know the name of it, just use the name, yeah, because
It's usually the same as the resource.
Yep. So if you go here and add it, you can search for ADF, and in this case, find it here, and easy peasy. Great, and we added the group, we added the instance to the group. Cool. So next step, Power BI, admin portal, and there is here a setting called API, allow service principals to use API, and we go there and we add the, so I've done this demo a few times before, it seems. And we add the group to this one. This means that everything within this group can now use the API. Every service principal, so every app like Azure Data Factory in this group can now use the REST API. And finally, go to the place itself and add the, and you can search for the name here as well. So just add this as at least a member, or an admin, but at least a member. I think it's already here, but let's just click it anyway. Yeah, it's this one. Now we made the connections, we added the authentication details. We have now given the ADF access to reach the Power BI datasets and run the different APIs there is. So we can go to ADF, and I just want to say, if you're working with Azure Synapse, this would be the same thing. It's just called Synapse pipelines, but same interface. So we could use a web activity, and under the settings, define here the URL, which I will zoom in a bit. And actually going to try to see if I can, maybe it's good enough. So it has some information here. It's API powerbi.com. You have to define then the group, which is the workspace. So workspace ID, and then dataset ID, and then at the endpoint here, and at the last part, dash refreshes, and this is the command for refreshing. So the cool part it actually follows the same structure as the URL here, so you can just take this whole thing and copy it in like this. Oops. Anyway, this whole thing, copy it in. There you go. And we can try to run it. And hopefully it will. And while it runs, the next step is it needs a blank body. Actually, I think this text could be removed, but I think this was the documentation. You should have this in it. It's just blank information. And then authentication, choose the system managed identity, and on resource, it just needs this this URL to point at the actual API as a resource. And it will run, and in this case, succeeded. And we can go here to our dataset and check if it actually refreshed. And as you can see here, it now refreshed a few minutes ago, so when we clicked. And under the refresh history of the dataset, we can see here it was refreshed. And we even get the little pointer here that we can see it's refreshed via the API. So if we ever want to audit how it was refreshed, we can check that here. So this was the simple steps to get started running the refreshes with the API. You have a question in the back?
Yeah, so this refresh doesn't count against the 8 or 48 refreshes?
Yes, it does. It does. The only thing that doesn't count against those, oh yeah, so for the online audience, the question is, does this count towards the limit of 8 for the Power BI Pro workspace, or for the workspaces? It does count against the limit. It also counts against the limit if you click refresh now in the interface. The only thing that doesn't count against this limit is manually updating the dataset and then publishing it to the service. But this is just way too clumsy, and I cannot recommend ever automating that thing. But I have seen it been done. It also counts towards the limit. Technically, it also counts toward the limit of the 48 in premium, but the limit is not there. I mean, so at any day, Microsoft can decide to actually put in a hard limit, but today it's not there, so it doesn't matter that it counts or not, but for any future scenario where they decide to put in a hard limit, it will also count for that scenario. Yeah. So now we know how to refresh a data set, which for, I think, almost all cases solve this because they don't have these exotic needs for things. Because now we can just take our transformation pipeline, our data warehouse pipeline, and at the end of that process, just go and say, hey, just update all our data sets, and this is fine. And this is also where we started. I mean, we did anticipate that this would happen, but this is where we started in the case here with the customer. So we implemented this, and we actually had it after the last bit, after the curate bit, it would update the data sets. So the problem is, can anyone guess what the next problem was in this case? We have one in the audience.
You want to do something afterwards, and you need to know when it's finished.
Yes, that's actually a good pointer. Yes, also that. But we don't cover this in this session. but also that you do want to track when it is done. No, so the problem here was that how do we decide when suddenly it's not the Power BI interface anymore controlling when it's updating? It's the pipeline itself for the data warehouse. And we need for the premium users data set, we need to update this every half hour because this data set wanted fresh data. So every time it's done, it's going to tell the data sets, go refresh. And they do. So what happens in the Pro workspace is that 30 past midnight, it says, go refresh, because the warehouse updated. And again at 1, and again at 2:30. And by 4 in the morning, it had used all the 8 refreshes, because, of course, it kept refreshing. For the premium, no problem, but for the Pro, it just used up all these refreshes. So we needed to find a way where we could limit it for some data sets, but not for others. And made a rough concept of it here. So we knew something was going to start the task, and then we realized that we do need some sort of scheduler that handles these things. We need a scheduler that makes sure that things are refreshed when they need to be refreshed, and also some monitoring and logging of then was it refreshed, like you talked about. Finally, we realized that a simple way to do this was to always have some data available to us that told us when the data sets needed to be refreshed the next time, because at that point, the logic became quite simple. Every time we run the pipeline, we just go ask the data set, does this need to be updated? Is this past its deadline for when it needed to be updated? And something that is perhaps very simple, but was hard for even the client to grasp is like, but if we say we want to update at 9, why would we want to wait till the warehouse is done and do it some minutes after? Are we not just back to what the service is doing? But the thing is, we don't care about exact times. We care about as fresh data as possible, and that happens if we actually wait for the data warehouse and not forcing something at other times. So we just needed to check when we updated the warehouse, was something past its deadline? That was the concept. Yeah, so we expanded upon the initial flow here and added some new parts. We added a view that would tell us when is the next time for the data sets to refresh. We added, of course, the actual refresh down here. Then we added a stored procedure that would use some metadata tables and generate the next refresh. So every time we refresh a data set, we run some procedure that will make sure that we get, well, then the next available time slot. Yeah, let's see how it works. So I want to preface this by saying what I also said earlier. This was a time limit in implementation. There's definitely things in here that I am not exactly completely comfortable with showing because it's not necessarily good code. It's a good concept. It's not good code. So yeah, time. So if we look at two main tables control this whole thing. There's a config, and I've had this discussion with some audiences. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit. I've had this talk with some audience, and I actually do believe someone made the argument that this would be much better to have these definitions in JSON. I can definitely see the appeal. But again, we needed something that the client was more comfortable with, and that was SQL. I'm sorry I cannot zoom in this one. So that means I am going to do... Does anyone remember the Windows Zoom desktop Windows button? Okay, doesn't matter. I'll explain it instead. So what you see here is... It's a bit clearer than it was from my angle. Definition of the dataset name. Definition of the dataset metadata, so the ID and the workspace ID, everything we need for the API call. Then we have the next refresh timer. And finally, and most importantly, there is the refresh policy. So the policy within our metadata for how and when this should be updated. And this policy is just key to another table. It doesn't mean anything by now, but then there is the other table with all the policies, which will have the name of the policy and will have all the times of day that this policy needs to update. So suddenly we can make very fine-grained control. We can say for one policy, it's 8 times per day. This is the classic patterns, and you want to have those within the workday. So we put those values in. We can have one that says daily with only one value of the day. And we can have one that does it every 30 minutes, but again, only within the workday. But could even do something that says, well, every 5 minutes from 8 to 9, and after 9, we only do it once, and the sky's the limit. It's all up to what we can imagine. We're not limited by half and full hours either. We can do even 1 second after 10 if this is what we want. Yeah, everything suddenly becomes possible. And on top of these, just to simplify things on the ADF side, we have a simple view that just gets us what we need exactly. So the view will not give us all the data sets. It will only give us the data set that needs to be refreshed. So let me just show you the very simple SQL code of the view. So it's a view with 3 columns and a simple where statement where if the next refresh value is lower than now, we include it in the view. Or if the next refresh is null, we also include it. And we do this because if we're adding a new entry, we just want it to update immediately and then start following its schedule after that. And finally, so this view is what we use in Data Factory. So every time the data warehouse is done, it goes to this view and checks, are there any data sets I should be updating? Goes to this list, updates them all, and for each and one of them, and you will see that in Data Factory in a bit, it will then run the stored procedure to go get a new refresh value for the data set. And this is the script that I am almost considering not to show. I won't mind, and I will also add this with the presentation, so you could, not should, but could copy it as is, but So we have here a stored procedure, which is hard to zoom in because you won't be able to see it, which is a mess. But what it does, without going into details, is it cross-joins the date time from the policies with the date of today and the date of tomorrow. So if something needs to be, if the next update is 2 in the morning and currently we are at 10 today, well then of course we also need all the timings from tomorrow to check if there's a new update tomorrow, and we also need those from today. So it just takes the 2 days, today and tomorrow, cross joins with the timings, and then it runs the logic where it checks that that it takes the most recent, the next one, the earliest date time after the time right now. And then some bit of clumsy hard code to take daylight saving into consideration. So yeah, definitely could be more robust, definitely could be improved, but the principle is there. So how does it look in ADF? It looks this way. So we have a lookup. There you go. So we have a lookup activity, which will go down and look into the view. And the view will show you, same as it showed in Server Management Studio, it will give it a list of values. Now ADF, for those that are not necessarily familiar with Data Factory, Data Factory can do loops over your data. So when you have a data with rows like this, you can loop through each of the row and do some activity. And in this activity, you can then use the data from the lookup inside this. So similar to before, we have inside this looping activity, we have the refresh data set, but this time it's a bit changed, because this time we actually add here some metadata definitions. So instead of having a manually hard-coded workspace ID, we just tell it to go fetch that ID from the table that it's looking into. So we say, well, we give it a list of all the data sets that needs to be refreshed, and we also give it all the data it needs to do so, and we then tell the script itself here to go get the workspace ID for that row you're looping through, and go get the dataset ID. So we can use those as parameters here. And finally, the same thing with the stored procedure. We'll run with the same objects. Your question?
On what interval are you running this? On a trigger interval are you running this ADF?
So the question is, on what trigger interval are we running this? We are running this after the data warehouse is done loading.
Okay, so you...
Yeah, because, I mean, we actually had this discussion. Would it make sense to do it in an interval that fitted the time slots? But not really, because, again, we only care about fresh data. We don't care about exact times for refreshing the data set. So as opposed to Power BI service, which will be unprecise, we actually want to be precise, but not on the time, but after the data warehouse. So we deliberately do this after the data warehouse is done. This is when the data is fresh. So in some sense, you could say that we go from a pull way of thinking to a push way of thinking. The data is ready, let's push it to the data set. Good question, by the way. But other than that, this is the same as the updating a single data set. Same simple REST API call. And then stored procedure, which works with a single data set at a time. We had the consideration, do we want to make a stored procedure that just updates all of them? Or do we want to make one that updates only a single value? And decided on a single data set for the reason that if something goes wrong, if it fails, if it doesn't update, we don't want to, for example, something that updates daily, if it fails, we don't want to say, well, then only try again next time you're supposed to. We actually want to keep retrying until it succeeds. So therefore, handled on a dataset by dataset basis, so we only update it if it actually succeeds in running. So we have this, it is loading a list. It should be, when we run this, it should now go and update our data sets. And as a result, they should all get a new next refresh value. And after that, the view will become empty because nothing needs to be updated anymore. And we will see if that happens. I really hope it does. Otherwise, something's wrong. So it's starting. There you go. All of them refreshed. And if we go to this Power BI page, we can now see that they have all been refreshed within. Oh, these two have been refreshed within this minute. And this is because this is a new one. This is because we want to add this to see how it works to add a new data set. So we have two, and they updated as they should, which is good. The third one is in a different workspace, so that is why it didn't do it. So we go here, we want to add a new data set. This is definitely a part where it could be made more user-friendly. Something where the user could type it in themselves, a form or something like that. But for now and for the concept, we'll just do it manually on the database itself. So we go here and take the data set, no workspace ID, put it here, add a name, so this is the sales new, and we don't need to add a date, but we also need to add the data set ID. And a policy. So let's say we use this one, just fine with 8 per day. And it's saved. Just double checking. Yeah, it's now on the list. Which means we updated all of these, and as you can see here, they all got new refresh dates. Some is going to update again at 12, one at 13, and one is going to do it in the evening because it's only a daily job. And then we have a new one with the null. So in the same thing here, we can check the lookup, looking at the view, and the view now only gives one data set that needs to be refreshed, and it doesn't have a timing. So we're just going to treat this as it meaning that it should be updated. And we could run the same thing again. Yeah, this is what it is to work in the tool. There you go. It took 15 seconds to look at the view.
It took 10 seconds for the auto resolve runtime to start up.
Wow. Anyway, it updated it. And if we go to our workspace, we should be able to see that it has been just updated. But the others was not updated again, as we wanted it to be. And it will have gotten now here a new refresh time, saying 30. Yeah, but we're almost there. So now we have it, a schedule where we can update dataset, we can define when they need to be updated. It's kind of updating itself on the fly, and everything seems good. There's a minor problem I can see here with the timing, but this is, I'm pretty sure it has something to do with the fact that I travel the time zone going here. So, and this was hard-coded hard-coded for Danish times, I think, because it worked a week ago back in Denmark. So let's say that this one was actually due to be updated at 9 again. I'll just do this manually for the demo. So this was due to update at 9, the new one was added, and we see again in the view, only takes those that needs to be updated. Yeah. So as the last step, and as you also asked the question about, we just simply go and have our full warehouse transformations here. Of course, in reality, this would be more advanced than 2 copy data activities. But we'll run them, and it will do as before. It will start actually updating the data. And exactly when it is done updating data, it will then run this other dataset refresh pipeline and make sure everything is refreshed afterwards. This usually shouldn't take long. Usually being the word. Demo gods, yeah. All right, I mean, you get the concept. We'll see data being updated when 25 seconds more, and then the thing starts running. So in the meantime, we can wrap up and take any questions. Let me just see here. No, wait, let's be patient. When 10 seconds, and then we'll do the questions. So close. No. It's the same. I mean, it's not an actual update pipeline. It's just copying the same data as the first one. This should not take longer. Anyway. So before questions, I just want to add that, yeah, well, it's a neat trick to be able to do this. Of course, in most cases, all we need is the REST API at the end of the warehouse. It's a rare occurrence that you have exotic ways of wanting to update it like this. So don't go from here and go and complicate your own setup just because it is here. Consider if it's good enough to just have it updated after your data warehouse transformations, and then add it there if it is. But consider doing so, because it definitely helps out with keeping data fresh. You get it more soon, and you avoid all the problems that are with unsynchronized jobs running. Yeah, I think that was it. Questions?
I think that's great. I love it. I think it's worth building as a utility for anyone who's actually going to try and build something like this next week. Thank you. My question is, did you consider getting the dataset IDs, like collecting them using config data, because they could change, couldn't they?
Yes, definitely. Really good question. So the question is, did we consider fetching those workspace ID and datasets IDs from the API itself? Was that right? Into the metadata system? Yes, we did consider that. But for this client, it would be almost non-value adding thing to do. So this is also why I say it would be nice to create a more robust tool for handling this. But in this case, no, it was not part of the scope, because they had maybe 5 datasets for the organization, and they could easily add a new one if they wanted to onboard new ones. If you were to do that, the only challenge I came up with is you need still to define the policies, so you still have these choices to be made around, well, when does it need to be refreshed? But I would say, if you do something like this, just have a standard policy of maybe 8 times per day, and then put everything there, and then have the action be actually change it to something else, and then suddenly you have a pretty good baseline, yeah. And it does. It's a new value add even. It does even remove all the having to, every time we have a new data set, we need to go to the service, we need to set up the same 8 hours that we do for every other data set. We could just have it one place and automatically update. So really, really good question and great suggestion. Yeah, yes.
And we ended up actually in some kind of spam protection, but we never found out. And we weren't hammering it each second. We were requesting the API like every 30 seconds or something. And yes, at some point it was blocking us out because it thought we were like some spammer.
Yeah.
Did that ever happen to you?
Yeah. We had the same exact experience. Question was, if we then do the next step and start monitoring, is the data set yet updated, because maybe we want to do something else afterwards? is there then going to be problems with a throttle limit or something like that? And we worked on it a bit, and we actually decided for this client that, well, they were actually not doing anything afterwards. So we started running into just the first problems and decided, well, let's just drop it and not finish, because it was an unneeded thing. But I think the throttle limits are documented on the API, and you should be able to maybe change the schedule.
Effects show something else than the documentation.
True.
It was kind of strange.
Okay.
Have you considered maybe switching the API calls, because Azure SQL database will be able to do API calls soon or now? I think it's in public preview. Have you considered doing the calls in the future from the database and not from the ADF?
The question is if I have considered doing the calls from the database and not the ADF.
Right now you're doing the lookup and the loop and everything. You could everything do in one procedure as well, probably in the future. Just call that procedure from ADF.
Yes. I would say no, I've not considered it, because I'm already a bit concerned with the current setup that I think it relies too much of putting the logic away from where the users can see it. I would actually consider going the other way and have the definitions not be in SQL but in some JSON files or something like that, be closer to the actual implementation. Because right now, for someone who did not design this or was not part of it, it would be a lot of, oh, so this calls this, what does this do? And then, yeah. So, and if you then have the SQL server also do the API calls, I think you do that even more. So I would be a bit careful with that. Question in the back.
Can you do more advanced refresh of the data set? Like if you have partitions, can you do just refresh one partition?
Yes. So you can refresh partitions, you can refresh single tables. But I believe that's you can only do this in premium workspaces, so this is a limitation, of course. But that topic, interesting topic, should be its own complete other session, because there are many options for when you go into that. So quickly, I forgot to repeat the question. So online audiences, it was the question of could we do more like advanced stuff like refreshing only partitions or refreshing only specific tables, and can that, but only in premium.
And follow up, could you call the XMLA endpoint from ADF as well? Would that be it?
Yes. So question is, could we call the XMLA endpoint from the ADF and then include all these more advanced refreshes in the XMLA endpoint within the pipelines of ADS? And the question, yes, absolutely, with Power BI Premium.
Yeah.
Yes. We have a question here on online. API do not allow concurrent refresh and do not allow refresh of particular tables. Oh, it is possible from PowerShell. Just a comment. Well, thank you online for correcting what I just said. Thanks. Question in the audience here.
Just wondering how you cope if there's a slow refresh and then a new refresh is scheduled, a refresh is still running, or if someone maybe manually initiated a refresh in the service and then your scheduled refresh clashed with that.
We did not solve it in an elegant way. We solved it in the fact that the new refresh will just fail if you try to do it. Yeah, so it's just going to fail and then try again next time. There's actually quite a few in this where it's not the most elegant implementation, because there's a lot of cases where it can fail, but that is not a problem because they will just pick up the next time and succeed. You also have the same problem if someone goes manually and clicks refresh now, then, and you define you want to run it 8 times, then it will of course fail later on in the day, and then you have a pipeline that fails. But it's not an actual problem because you will miss out on those last refreshes. But same as if you defined them in Power BI, not much different. So thank you all for great questions and for the interest and for joining here today. And I just wish you a great day and thank you for coming.